Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Yiling Zhuang. I'm the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Water Wednesday. Welcome to Water Wednesday. Water Wednesday is a Facebook Live series about Florida's precious water resources. Every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, a scientist from University of Florida will live stream a topic about Florida's water resources and what we can do to protect it. So today's topic is about how to make your backyard a wetland oasis for wildlife. And our guest speaker is Krista Stump, the Natural Resources Agent in Osceola County. Now let's welcome Krista.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Yelan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
When Krista is sharing the screen, I do want to mention, since this we have participants on Zoom and we also have attendees on Facebook Live. So for the Zoom participants, please turn off your cameras. So in that way, your image will not be released on Facebook Live. Thank you.
All right. So with that, as long as everyone can see my screen, okay, we're going to get started. As Yelan mentioned, today we're going to talk about how can we make our backyard a wetland oasis for wildlife. Now, just to briefly mention, I know a lot of us already understand the benefits of nature, but there's so many, including our physical health, our mental health, our economy, especially down here in Florida, really depends on healthy natural areas and healthy water bodies, healthy wetlands, right? And of course, with the environment, everything is so interconnected, and to have healthy wildlife, native wildlife, they depend on plants, water, and soil. So even though we're focusing on the water today, just keep in mind that all of these are going to impact the health of wildlife. And Florida is rapidly growing. We know this. And as we grow, we continue to develop more and more. This can cause some habitat fragmentation. So wildlife are used to living in these, they need larger areas of land, and we develop roads or we develop communities and break up their habitat. But thankfully, there are studies that show that even if we live on small plots of land, ½ acre to an acre, our yards, if we provide enough habitat for animals, can actually bridge that gap that we're losing. So as we know, our health and well-being are closely tied to the health of wildlife because of all the benefits of nature and all the benefits that wildlife get from nature as well. And that's because the wildlife, their health is directly tied to the health of their habitats. So let's move forward and talk about how can we bring a healthy habitat into our backyard. Well, first we need to talk about the three main components of healthy habitat. We need food, water, and shelter, right? And even though today we're going to mainly focus on water, I will briefly touch on food and shelter as well. So the first place to start is look at your own yard. So does your yard look more like on the left side of the screen, as a lot of typical yards do, where it's very low diversity of plants and different features, meaning that mostly we have just a bunch of lawn, so turf grass that spans, and then maybe some bushes here or there, maybe a tree or two. But wildlife really need very diverse amount of plants and different features, including water. And not only do we need to look around, but in our yards, look up and look down, because different wildlife they dwell on different stories. So maybe they're in the canopy, maybe they're mid-story, maybe they're the understory. And as we look up and down around our yards, look for existing water features. Are there places where water tends to puddle? Do you already have a pond? What are you working with? So once you do that, then we can move forward. And we can turn to natural wetlands to help inspire us and to understand how we can incorporate water into our yards, because there are many different benefits that wetlands provide. And if we're trying to provide some of those benefits ourselves, we can look at the way that water flows in and out of a wetland, right? So we want maybe some moving water, some stagnant areas. But what's the main thing you'll notice in this picture? Is it just a pond with nothing around it? No, there's lots of plants, and that's what wildlife is it needs plants for not only food, but shelter around the water. So you can see how interconnected all of those things are. So what do? How can we provide water for wildlife into our yard? Well, it can be super elaborate if you'd like. Maybe you have a budget or you're wanting to do a remodeling project and you want to incorporate a pond or maybe a water garden into your backyard. But it doesn't have to be that elaborate. It could be something as simple as a dish with water, for instance, a bird bath, right? And I know many of you will probably be wondering about things like mosquito control, algae control. We're going to get to that shortly. But if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to add them on chat. So with bird baths, especially down here in Florida where mosquitoes are a huge issue, but regardless, just for in case of any bacteria growth, you want to keep that water very clean and fresh because we're trying to provide water to help our wildlife, but if it's harboring disease or mosquitoes, that can have a negative impact. So try and keep the water moving. That's the name of the game when we're trying to fight mosquitoes. And what you can implement is something really simple, like is in this picture here. This is actually a solar bird bath fountain. And many of you may have seen these before, but there's all different types. And that just keeps that water moving and flowing. And so that the water isn't stagnant and more likely to harbor mosquitoes or disease. Regardless of if you have a bird bath fountain in there, you still need to change out that water quite regularly. Now, if you want to take it a step further, something else you could do is try and put together a water garden. So a water garden can technically be in ground like a pond, or there are guides on how to put together a water garden in something like this picture, which is kind of just like a pot that was turned into a water garden. But you can go into, any garden center, big box store, and there's some ready-made materials that you could find, such as, a rubber liner for a pond, preformed ponds, or even just large tubs. And so that's an easy place to start. But when we're making these, we need to be very careful about what kind of plants we're selecting, right? Because you need to know where you're going to put the water feature, because the plant selection depends on how much light it gets and also the size of your garden. You don't want to overcrowd the garden or the pond at all with those aquatic plants because they won't live. And not only will you accidentally waste money, but then you won't be helping the wildlife with added plant features. So continuing to talk about plants for your water garden, and I know some of you may have questions about this too. So if you have any follow-up questions, we'll address them later. But when you're looking at plants, they're typically grouped into how they grow or where you can find them, meaning they are floating, they are submerged, or they are emergent. And the best design is to include all three. Just like when we're looking at our yards and that picture of wanting a diverse habitat, we also want the different types of plants to be diverse in our pond or our water garden. And like I already mentioned, choose the right size plants. So that means you're going to have to look up information about the plants so you know the mature size, meaning how big is this plant going to get when it's completely fully grown. So as you're putting together the pond or the water feature at first, it's a lot like landscaping. It might look kind of sparse. Keep in mind, we need it to have plenty of room to grow into its mature size. And the rule of thumb here is you don't want the plants to cover any more than 2/3 of the water surface after they're fully mature, because we still need there to be sunlight, some sunlight to get through, right? So you need some surface of the water open. All right, but I know we've gotten some questions about plant selection. So I'll make a couple notes about that and provide some resources. So native plants are probably your best choice and where you want to look to first, because a lot of our native wildlife, they adapted to use native plants. So that's their go-to. They love the native plants. And so they'll attract the greatest variety of birds and other wildlife. However, you can't just select any native plant and expect it to work. It's still very dependent on your site conditions. So that means, where do you live? I'm in the central zone or the 9B hardiness zone. So you need to look up your hardiness zone. You need to think about the soil conditions if you're planting in ground, and if maybe you're doing plantings around the pond. And very important is to make sure you know the sunlight exposure and how, so that you can match it with the type of plants you're picking. And then flood, drought, or salt tolerance, we would definitely want aquatic plants around the edge that are flood tolerant. Now, here are the resources. We can happily send these out to you, or if you want to just jot these down very quickly. For aquatic plants, first of all, we have, through the University of Florida, there is a repository of online documents, and we do have several on the topic of aquatic plants. So you can use this link here to visit all those documents, or just simply, search UF-EDIS and then aquatic plants. And then you can browse and see the different topics. There's guides on plant selection. There's guides on pond maintenance. So definitely start there. UF also has a Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, and they have a plant directory. So if you go to plants.ifas.ufl.edu, and then you can go to their plant directory, that's also a great place to get started. You can look at what kind of site conditions are needed, sunlight exposure, all of those things. And then a final resource for you, this is not through the university, but it has excellent information on native plants, is the Florida Native Plant Society Plant Guide. And with this one, you can create a search by putting in all of your conditions. You can even hit a radio button that says that you want to attract wildlife, and then it'll come back with all the different plants that would be applicable. And so that could help you get started when you're looking for plants. And I mentioned algae can be an issue. It's important to keep in mind that algae is very natural. So it's natural to have some algae, especially when we're talking about wetlands and water, but we can see it overgrow if we aren't careful. So algae needs sunlight in order to grow. That is why ponds that are completely devoid of plants are very easily susceptible to algae overgrowth. So add some plants. Remember, don't go crazy, less than 2/3 of the surface area, but that should help control it. You also just want to limit the amount of nutrients going into that pond. I would suggest, not fertilizing or selecting plants that would not need fertilization. But if you do, just do it responsibly and only apply what your plants need. There are actually slow release nutrient tablets that you can use, and you can kind of push it into the soil so that it's not, on the surface and way too much. With the slow release, it releases the nitrogen at a rate that's really consistent with what the plants need. So look for that if you do need to fertilize. If you are implementing fish into a pond, we won't go, unfortunately, with the short talk today, we can't go into too many details about that. Once again, check out the University of Florida's resources on that at the EDIS website, but don't overfeed or overstock fish, because that's a very delicate balance with the nutrients. And if you do either of those, they will produce so much waste that will also create more nutrients, and then you'll have this cycle that's completely out of whack. So just be careful about that and try and follow guidelines with how much you feed and stock your fish. Okay, now here's one of the biggest topics or questions that we get, and topics, and that is, okay, we're trying to create this wetland oasis in our backyards, but what about mosquitoes? And it is an issue, so we do want to be careful. Now with ponds in particular, if you have one of those small container gardens, what you want to do is regularly flush it, meaning add enough water until the container flows over the top, and that will flush out any of the larvae that's on the surface. You can also install a pump, especially if you have a larger water garden or a pond. You would want to try and install a pump if possible to keep that water circulating. Another option is to add fish. There are native small fish that you can add that control mosquitoes. And finally, I recommend you can use Mosquito Dunks. These are round donut looking cakes of a naturally occurring bacteria, abbreviated to BTI. And it's naturally occurring, it's safe for the environment, it's safe for pets. It doesn't kill all our beneficial insects, so like our bees and our pollinators, which is so important. But it slowly dissolves, and as it does, it controls the mosquitoes. So that's something to look into, something you can find online or in most garden centers too. And finally, the last thing you want to do, we address, maybe your ponds itself. You can also put those dunks into if you have larger bird baths. But a lot of times mosquitoes are actually breeding and harboring in other places around your yard. And by minimizing all of those spots, you can actually help control your mosquitoes and still be able to have a nice pond or water feature. First and foremost, when was the last time you cleaned out your gutters? So cleaning out your gutters regularly really helps with mosquitoes. They love to lay eggs in the debris and the tiny amounts of water up in your gutters. Look for any flower pots or buckets or tires, anything around the house, maybe like kids' toys that collect water, and you want to dump those regularly and try and keep it from any water staying for more than 24 hours. And then we already addressed the ponds. So just regularly treat the ponds, use a dunk. You can implement fish. And then with bird baths, change it regularly. And if you can, implement a small fountain or some type of water feature to keep that water moving. I hope with that, it covers some of the main points about mosquitoes. I know it is a huge issue, so if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to add those. We'll try to address them. To finish up here, I'm going to go over just a few other points. Remember when we talked about how the habitat is not just water, it needs food and shelter. So here are a couple other things to look at as you're adding water and water features into your backyard. There are many birds and other animals and mammals. In fact, more than a third, they actually require a cavity tree. So they need a hole in a dead tree for nesting or shelter. So if you have any dead trees, they're also called snags, and it's very secure and it's sound, and so it's not a safety hazard. Try and keep one or two up, and you'll actually be able to help a lot of wildlife that way. Also take a look at your lawn. Are there chunks of area of your lawn that you never use, either to play or to sit in, that you could actually change out with something that provides more plant diversity? For instance, you could add some trees or shrubs, or there's different types of ground cover other than lawn that can have added benefits. So take a look at that if it's something you're willing to do. And then finally, remember, it all starts with healthy soil. If we have healthy soil, we'll have healthy plant communities, and our wildlife depends heavily on healthy plant communities. So try and keep your soil healthy. You can mulch to keep it moist. Mulch also helps to inhibit any weeds. It keeps the soil temperature from overheating and also improves with the fertility and texture of your soil. And as you're fertilizing in your yard, whether it's for your lawn or maybe ornamentals, always conduct a soil test before you fertilize. This is especially more important if you're adding a pond or other water feature. And when it rains, if you just fertilize, all that fertilizer, those nutrients are going to get into that pond. And that's when you'll see the algae overgrowth, and the system will get out of whack. So only fertilize when you need it. And so contact your local extension office if you need help with how to conduct a soil test. All right, so to finish up, let's talk about some all-around tips to making our backyard a wildlife habitat. First and foremost, we talked about we need all of the components of habitat: food, water, shelter, and a space to raise young. We talked about the importance of native plants and trees, and I provided a couple of resources of where you can look that up, because wildlife adapted with native plants. There are non-native safe plants that you can add as well, but you can't go wrong with native, as long as you're looking at your site conditions and you're making sure it still is the right plant in the right place. Limit the use of your chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So make sure you need it and you're using it properly. So follow the label. The label is the law. Try to include plantings or hummingbirds, butterflies, and our pollinators. So as you're making plant selections, remember the Native Plant Society guide actually allows you to filter through by wildlife and pollinators. So look into that. With our water, we want to add water features. That was the whole point of today's talk, but it has to be clean. So we need to make sure we're not overcommitting. If we're not able to take care of a pond, let's start with a bird bath and change that out regularly. I mentioned snags, which are dead trees. So if you see you have one that's very secure and safe at home, try and maybe you can keep it up to help with the over a third of animals and birds that require them for shelter. And finally, if you're just at a loss, you identified with that picture of just a spanning lawn with a couple shrubs, and that's what your backyard or front yard is looking like. Go the next time you're out at a park or a natural area, just really look around and look up and look down and become inspired with ways that you can add more of those types of features into your yard. So with that, we have plenty of time for questions. So if there's any questions, I'll take them now.
Thank you, Krista. I posted those links both on Zoom and Facebook, so they can, if you want to visit, get like a plant directory, you can just click those links. And if you have any questions, you can just put, if you're on Facebook, because I'm looking at my Facebook now, you can just leave it in the comment section, because I know for Facebook, because we use Zoom to talk to Facebook, but somehow there's about 10 seconds delay. So we'll start from our Zoom session first. So for our Zoom participants, if you have any questions, feel free to leave in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand. I will unmute you so you can ask the question directly to Krista. And I took some notes here, actually. I think it's because the backyard wildlife, I always say it just like plants, wildlife, they just like us, they just like human beings. So they need food, they need clean water, they need shelter, they need space, just like you and I. So I hope when you create your backyard oasis for wildlife, you can also keep this four key points. And back to our chat box. So the question here is, do mosquito dunks hurt dragonfly larvae?
You want to double check that what dunk you're getting, it will say that it's it doesn't harm beneficial insects. They shouldn't. Yeah.
That's good. And we also have an attendee from Central Wisconsin. So welcome, virtually welcome to Florida. Okay, so let me check our Facebook if we have any questions here. So
while Elin does that, I'll add that welcome from Wisconsin. Check your Wisconsin extension if you don't already go to their classes or look up their resources, and they'll provide you with native plants and plant selections for your area.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm looking at my Facebook. I don't see any questions. I did post a link. It's our evaluation link. We will greatly appreciate if you can just take a couple of minutes to finish that survey for us, to tell us what you have learned and how we can improve the Water Wednesday series. And if you are on Facebook Live, we will also really appreciate you give us some love, so we know we did a good job. Here, I just saw another question here. It's how to keep wasps away from feeders, specifically hummingbird feeders. That's a good question.
That's difficult. I would say with many pests, look at the source, so where their nests are, and try and control that there. And then also if there is a spot that the wasps particularly like to hang out, then be strategic with where you're placing the hummingbird feeders. However, there's no great solution. Change it out regularly and look for where their nests are, and if you can control that.
So you can see if there's some work. So it's not like you install it and you leave it there. Another question here is, what if you would like to encourage a wet area in your yard, but it's dry in the winter?
Yeah, so with that, there's an opportunity you could create one of those water gardens. So that's an artificial use of, if it's only dry and not cold. I don't know if you're down here in Florida, but that can be an issue. There are resources out there for overwintering. And so if you look up UF and then overwintering and ponds, there should be some resources out there as well, if that's a concern. With it being dry though, if it's a part of your yard that is occasionally dry but does get wet, you could look into implementing a rain garden, and there's resources through UF about rain gardens too. I hope that answered your question, but you can still implement different water things even if you do have it's dry at times in your yard.
Yeah, and for Florida winter, because I always say Florida doesn't have winter. Florida has wet season and a dry season. And from November to next, like March, around that time period, we don't get a lot rain. So yard tend to be, if you want to create a wet area, it tend to be dry. So when Krista said you can find the information from UF, so the best place you can search, it's called EDIS, so EDIS. So you can put UF IFAS, EDIS, and at that database, you can find a lot of fact sheets. I think Krista, you covered everything. I don't see any more questions here. So that's
Awesome.
great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Krista. And also thank you for all the attendees for your time. And before we stop the live stream, when I say stop the live stream, I go, oh, it's not a question, say thank you. We really appreciate your time. And also, if you can take the survey, the Water Wednesday survey, I post the link in the chat box. So it will only take you a minute, but it can help us to improve the series. And before I close today's session, because one thing just occurred to me, I forgot to mention, now scammers are getting really crazy. They are copying our events and post it somewhere else. When you register event, they ask your personal information and the financial information. So just want to remind you, keep all your personal information secure. Don't release that to insecure website. And for all the links below our Facebook live video, if it's not posted by the admin, please be careful before you click it. All right. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.